Does God foreknow the future? Some surprising answers coming your way today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. One quick announcement before we jump in. So last week I had mentioned that we'd be opening up my Introduction to Philosophy class that I've been advertising that's coming up here to the public for registration. But you may have noticed that no registration link has gone live on this channel yet. The reason for that is that the system we're working with ended up having a glitch, and so there's been a slight delay while they're fixing that bug in the system. As soon as that's fixed, and the expectation is that will happen in the next day or two, the registration link will go live. The class is still happening. All of that's still moving forward. Don't worry. But in the meantime, here's what I'd recommend. We have a link below where you can put your email address into our system, and that way, when that link does go live, you'll get a notification that it's up, it's running, and you can go ahead and register for the class. So if you're interested in doing that, I'd recommend you follow that link and give us your email address, and then you'll be notified when that registration link is finally working. So, okay, now back to the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Well, today on the podcast, we are doing something a little unusual. We've just wrapped up our episode on the problem of evil, and as promised, we will be gathering up those questions you asked, scouring those comments, putting together a Q&A episode on the problem of evil, and that will be coming your way shortly. But for now, we're taking a little pause from that and wading into some other waters, although those waters are not completely alien to the things that we've discussed. One of the topics we're going to be talking about today, is the question of divine foreknowledge and whether or not God foreknows the future. Now, with this, we're also trying something new, a new segment, if you will, here on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. My producer has challenged me, asking me whether or not it is possible for me to address a topic in only an hour. Now, that may sound like a simple task to most of you, but to any of you who have been following this podcast for a while, you do know that I have a tendency to do deep dives and follow the history of ideas in any number of directions. And before you know it, one episode turns into 2, turns into 3, turns into 5 with a Q&A appended to the end of it. And each of those ends up being 2.5, 3 hours long. So it is a real question. It's a legitimate question, but it is a question that I am convinced I can do it. Yeah, I can do it, right? We'll find out. And the hope is, actually, this is kicking off what we hope to be a new segment that will appear from time to time here on the podcast, which is, well, I don't know that we've officially come up with a name for it, but Jacobs in brief. The idea is that because obviously there are lots of folks who really love the 2 hours, the 3 hours, the lengthy multi-series and all that sort of stuff, there's also folks who really would like to be able to dive into a topic and reach some sort of resolution with that topic within, say, an hour. And so the idea here is that because some of these topics go on and on and on, like the problem of divine hiddenness, great topic, very, pleased with what we did there in terms of that series, but, not everybody's going to have the hours upon hours to dig through that. Same with the problem of evil. And so the idea is that perhaps what we can do is we can do these sort of Cliff Notes versions of it, Jacob's Notes versions of these topics, where I dive into something and I'm stuck with a 1 hour timer. I have to actually make it through the entire thing in just 1 hour. And so we're going to test that. We're going to test that here today and see if I can do it. My producer doesn't think I can. I think I can. I think so. So we're gonna, once I kick this off here, we're gonna hit start on a timer, and we're gonna see which one of us is right, if I can actually do it. So in terms of the topic, that's on the docket here, I've chosen to use as our first episode of Jacob's in Brief, or whatever we're going to call this, the problem of divine foreknowledge. Not really the problem of divine foreknowledge. The problem of divine foreknowledge is really sort of the question about whether or not foreknowledge and free will can coexist, whether or not God foreknowing the future somehow undermines free will. I'd love to touch on that topic here in this 1 hour, but I have a feeling I might not make it that far. But the thing that occasioned this is someone reached out to me, at least a listener reached out to me with some questions about something that they've heard me say a number of times, which is that I've talked about the Eastern Church Fathers do not seem to take the position that God knows the future until he has resolved to, make creatures and with that bring about certain futurities. So this has come up specifically in the context of why would God make the damned? And here I appealed to John of Damascus, and his answer to that being that God doesn't know the damned will be damned before he chooses to make them. And so for that reason, that's raised a number of questions, a number of points of confusion for folks, because to a lot of listeners, that sounds like I'm suggesting that the Eastern Church Fathers are what are called open theists. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself because then I'd be cheating the timer if I start to actually go into the explanation. But the idea here is that what I'm going to jump into today is I'm going to try to put some flesh and some clarity on this point about the various positions on divine foreknowledge and creaturely choice and things like that, and where the Eastern patristic view that I've expounded in other places, like that letter on why would God make the damned, and that I've also touched on in the problem of evil segments, to try to put some flesh on that in order to clarify exactly what this position is and what this position is not. So with that, let's go ahead and hit this timer in 3, 2, 1. We're rolling. Okay, so the problem of divine foreknowledge, the question of divine foreknowledge. A lot of times when people think about the question of does God know the future, there's in sort of contemporary popular level and even not so popular level philosophy of religion or theology discussions about that topic, you end up getting a certain handful of positions. One of those positions is what's sometimes called just simple foreknowledge, the idea that, of course, God knows the future. And so we have this sort of simple foreknowledge where God just being, omniscient, knowing all things, he just knows all things, including futurities. So the futurities about whether or not I will eat breakfast tomorrow, that has a truth value, it's true or false, and God knows which one it is, so he must know that sort of thing. And so that's sort of a simple foreknowledge view that just answers yes, God knows all things, the future is amongst the things that are knowable, and therefore God knows them. That's the one view. There is also with this sometimes what's referred to in contemporary discussions as Molinism or middle knowledge. And this is the view that, yes, God knows futurities. Yeah, he knows whether or not you're going to eat breakfast tomorrow. But it's also a claim that suggests that God also knows a series of hypotheticals, right, counterfactuals. So he knows that if I were in, this situation tomorrow, somebody invited me out to brunch tomorrow, that I would say yes, or I would say no. That doesn't necessarily mean somebody will invite me out to brunch tomorrow, but it does know that God knows what would be if. And so there's a certain truth value to even those counterfactuals or those hypotheticals or whatever. And in this sense, God has a bunch of middle knowledge. Yes, he knows what will occur. He knows what is, he knows what was, he knows what will be. But at the same time, he knows what would be if. And so this is where you get this hypothetical or what's called middle knowledge, this middle between things that are absolutely necessary, things that will be contingently, like whether or not you'll eat breakfast tomorrow, and then stuff that's in between, these sort of hypotheticals. And then what you have is you have certain positions that are relatively innovative, not relatively, they're really innovative, that have emerged over, the decades in recent times, initially in the form of process philosophy, and then in Protestant evangelical circles in the form of what's called open theism. And this is the view that God doesn't know the future. And so a number of folks, certainly in the process philosophy, there was a number of innovations. Process philosophy is a certain form of philosophy that, anybody who knows my story and has listened to my wild ride to orthodoxy, for example, knows that I used to be a process philosopher back in my wild-eyed, philosopher of religion heretical days. I was a process philosopher. And so I rejected a lot of classical divine attributes and did not feel beholden to the things of tradition or sacred scripture or whatever it may be. And so it is with process philosophers. I think you get a pretty clear sense of what process philosophers think with the title of Charles Hartshorne's book, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. That gives you a sense of how much process philosophers think of the classical view of God. They definitely reject it. And so with that, believing that somehow God foreknowing the future is in some ways a hindrance to human freedom, and it problematizes in some ways the ability of the philosopher of religion to answer the problem of evil, they basically end up rejecting, amongst other things about the classical view, they reject the idea that God has foreknowledge of the future. And this what creates an open future. The future is open-ended. It's not clear to anyone, not even God, what might transpire. Now, process philosophy had held a lot of things that would be rejected outright by any sort of classical theists, by Protestants, by Catholics, and so on. But there did emerge, I think it was in the 70s maybe, there did emerge certain philosophers of religion and theologians in Protestant evangelical circles who began to entertain, well, maybe actually this thing about an open future is actually biblical. And so this is where you had figures like Clark Pinnock or William Hasker or Greg Boyd, who started to advocate this view that, well, maybe actually if we look at Scripture, what we find in Scripture is there's evidence that the future actually is open. Maybe God doesn't really know the future and so on. And so they tried to build a biblical case for the idea that God does not know the future. And that's what became known as open theism, right? The openness referring to the open nature of the future, sometimes called free will theism, but I think that's poorly named. Open is a little more to the point in terms of what it is they were really advocating. Yes, there was a concern for free will, but the open-ended nature of the future was the main thing that was driving the position. And so anyway, when somebody approaches these theological discussions and in the sort of Protestant context, especially, sometimes in the Catholic context, these are normally the sort of three roads that are laid out before them. I just believe that God has simple foreknowledge, therefore he knows all things, including the future. I believe that he has middle knowledge, so he knows the future, but he also knows a series of, counterfactuals, hypotheticals, maybe possible worlds, something like that. Or I think God doesn't know the future at all, and it's very open-ended precisely because we have free will, and so God just can't really know in advance what we're going to do until we decide to do it, and therefore we're open theists or something like that. Now, the thing is, what I've talked about in the past is I've talked about a couple of different things that I think have raised some questions about where exactly I stand on this topic, where I understand the Eastern Church Fathers to stand on this topic, and have raised some points of confusion. Specifically, the point of confusion that I mentioned is that I've talked about the fact that, John of Damascus, in his exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, when answering the question, why would God make the damned? His answer is that God does not know the damned will be damned before he decides to make them. And this is something that I fleshed out originally on my Substack in this letter to a 15-year-old girl who wrote to me asking that very question, why would God make the damned? And so on my Substack, you can find that letter. And then we've also posted that audio letter, the audio version of that, here on the podcast. And because of that, that got raised some curiosity, some questions about whether or not I was suggesting somehow that the Eastern Church Fathers, that John of Damascus in particular, maybe were open theists. And so that was a curiosity that began to emerge. And I saw this emerge quite plainly when I made an appearance on Faith Unaltered. So Faith Unaltered is, it's another podcast, and they invited me on specifically because of that letter and some discussions they were having about God and time, and this question of foreknowledge was definitely considered relevant to the soil that they were sort of tilling there in their discussion. So they had me on to discuss that. And in the context of that, I could tell that there were certain folks during the Q&A who were still not quite grasping the nature of the Orthodox position as I had expounded it, the nature of the position found amongst the Eastern Church Fathers as I had expounded it, and wondered if I was saying it's open theism, that they hold to open theism, and having trouble discerning how it's different from that. Now, where I would like to begin is actually not with the Eastern Church Fathers, but rather with a discussion that emerges in the Latin West that most people, other than those of us odd birds who tend to dig around in Latin, medieval, scholastic, metaphysical discussions, are unaware of. And yet, I think, again, provides some important context for the sorts of things that I've said about the Eastern Church Fathers, generally, John of Damascus specifically, but, as we'll see, today when I talk about this, he's far from the only one who actually takes the position that I'll be ascribing, to the Eastern Fathers. So the Latin discussion really sort of emerges because of this question of the relationship between God's intellect and God's will. So beginning in sort of early scholastic discussions, let's start with somebody like Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas basically ends up advocating for a position that's essentially sort of like a Christian Aristotelian view. And it's a Christian Aristotelian view that's sort of like a blend of Aristotle and something said by Augustine in his De Trinitate. So starting with the background of this position, Aristotle had actually denied that God knows the world. Now, there are all sorts of asides, questions about exactly whether or not the traditional reading of Aristotle on this topic is correct. You could see my Leibniz book for some asides about that. But for our purposes, we'll just let the traditional view, the traditional reading stand, which is that Aristotle is attuned to the fact that if I were to look on you and you were to move or to change, then I, as a perceiver of you, would change. In other words, you're sitting across from me, you lift your arm. That's a change in you. Well, in my mind's eye, as I perceive you, there are shifting properties. I see in my mind your arm rising, which is in fact a change in me. And so Aristotle was concerned that if God perceives the world, if he looks on the world, if he knows the world, and the world is shifting and changing and moving, then God will shift and change and move. Now, the reason that's especially problematic is because Aristotle's God is primarily a metaphysical principle. Aristotle's God is the one who does not shift and change and move, but underwrites or undergirds or stands beneath all of the shifting and changing and moving stuff in the world. So that's why he's sometimes referred to as the unmoved mover, or more accurately, the immutable, the unchangeable changer, right? The one who doesn't change, who doesn't shift, who doesn't mutate, but who causes all the stuff that moves into being, that mutates into being, that changes, to come into being and to exist. And so Aristotle's primary concern when he's thinking about what God's real role is from a metaphysical perspective is that God's primary trait is that he doesn't change, right? He causes other things to move and to change, but he himself doesn't move and change. And so for that reason, the idea that God might look on the world and perceive the world, and in perceiving the world change, well, that was problematic for Aristotle. Now, somebody like Augustine of Hippo is well aware that if this were true, Christians would have a problem, because it sure seems like God knows things about the world. Seems like God makes choices about the world, that he interacts with the world, that, that there is some sort of world-God contact going on here beyond what the traditional Aristotelian view would be. Because for Aristotle, how he solves this is he suggests that God thinks about himself, right? So in order to have immutable, unchanging thoughts, he thinks on the one perfect, immutable, unchanging thing, which is himself. Augustine knows he can't say that. And so what Augustine does is he tries to solve the problem of divine mutation with foreknowledge. So he suggests that, well, yes, things change over time and things like that, but each moment is sort of a moment of being. And so if God knows all of those moments, then there's a certain sense in which rather than there being shifting or changing or mutating stuff in the mind of God, he sees it all at once. And he perceives it all at once. And it's an unchanging, immutable whole. So that perception or that knowledge of the world is really, it doesn't affect or threaten his unchangeableness, his immutability. And then what we find in Aquinas is basically a hybrid or a merger of these two things. Aquinas ends up advocating exactly what Aristotle does, which is that God thinks about himself. However, what he actually suggests is that there are two ways of knowing something. You can know it directly, or you can know it by its causes. Well, what's the cause of all things? God. And so God, in knowing himself, he also knows all the things that he causes, which is everything. All of us. And so in this sense, Aquinas still has a very sort of a sort of static picture of all things, right? There is this knowledge of the essence, and from the essence, this knowledge of the things that it causes. So you get something that's very much a hybrid of what we find in terms of the solution of Augustine and some of the things that are said by Aristotle. Now, in the wake of Aquinas, there were those who were deeply concerned about whether or not the views espoused by Aquinas might actually in some ways undermine the contingency of the world and especially the freedom of creatures, making all things as necessary as God. Now, why is that? Well, because according to Aquinas, what you have is you have that God's essence is the cause of all things. Well, the problem you have is that if in some ways all things, the things that come about, are caused or in some ways an extension of the divine essence, which is certainly what it sounds like Aquinas is saying, and then he's suggesting that God just thinks on his essence, and through knowing his essence, he knows all things. It certainly sounds like all things are in some ways an inevitable or a necessary extension of the divine nature, of the divine essence. And this was a worry to the voluntarists. And it was a worry because they recognized, well, according to Christian tradition, according to Christianity, contrary to certain, that might be fine with certain pagans, but Christianity has always held that God freely chooses to make the world, and that within the world, he creates free beings who make free choices, and those choices could be otherwise. So there's a great deal of contingency, things that could be otherwise, amongst the things that are, including the very fact that they are in the first place. God freely decides to make the world and then puts in it a bunch of free beings who do things that could be otherwise. So the voluntarists ended up pushing back against this sort of this more Thomistic view of divine knowledge and arguing for something else. And the something else we first see in somebody like Henry of Ghent. So Henry of Ghent is a voluntarist. And just to quickly offer a definition of what I mean by a voluntarist, in the medieval period, the mind was typically interpreted, understood as consisting of two faculties, right? The intellect and the will. The intellect makes judgments about what you might do. It assesses, it analyzes. So if I'm hungry and I'm like, well, what should I do? Should I eat or not eat? If I should eat, should I eat a salad? Should I eat pizza? What should I eat? Those sorts of analyses are the types of things that the intellect engages in, a series of judgments. And then the will is the acting faculty. Once you arrive at some sort of a judgment and then you act on it, now that is an activity of the will. A choice takes place. Well, in the medieval period, there was a question of whether or not the will actually has the capacity to say no to the intellect, or whether it's just sort of bound by wherever the train of judgments leads you. Well, the intellectualist tended to say, well, I think the will is just a blind follower of the intellect. Wherever the intellect lands, that's what the will does. Voluntarists, on the other hand, said, no, I think the will has a dynamic role to play in the exercise of your reason and your free will. The will can intervene and redirect the judgments. It can reject judgments. It can send the intellect back to work and so on. So Aquinas was on the intellectual side of this dispute. And on the other side were the voluntarists. And Henry of Ghent is an example of a voluntarist where he thinks like, no, I don't think at the end of the day, the will is just sort of this blind slave to the intellect. I think it actually does have a proactive and important role to play in the exercise of reason and judgment and ultimately choice. And this comes out specifically in this discussion about the nature of divine knowledge. So Henry of Ghent makes a very important point. He suggests that when we're talking about the nature of a thing, and specifically a contingent thing, there's no removing that idea of that thing. There's no removing that thing from the basis for its existence. In other words, let's just take a human being. A human being by nature is contingent. It's dependent. It does not exist in itself. And so the very idea of a human is something that is referential. A human being as a contingent being depends upon, and then you fill in the blank. Now, on the one hand, we could say it depends upon your parents and them upon their parents and things like this, but ultimately it depends upon God. You and I only exist if God decides that he wants human beings to exist. In this moment, we don't have existence in our own right. It's given to us by God and upheld by God. And so the very concept is inextricable from that thing or that being that gives to us existence, which is God. And so Henry of Ghent suggests that the idea that somehow the possibility of a human being might just sort of float in the mind of God, detached from any choice on his part, is absurd. Because the human being, the very concept of the human being, is only intelligible and only really possible in a meaningful way, if God's open to making human beings. And so for that reason, Henry of Ghent rejected the idea that there's just sort of knowledge that's there in God because he's omniscient. And this is really sort of the start of the discussion that's about to unfold. Aquinas thinks the nature of God, God's essence, right? The nature of God is to know all things. You know, that's his nature. Amongst the many attributes of God, one of them is to know all that is knowable. And so knowing all that is knowable, therefore he knows things like future contingents and creatures like us. But Henry of Ghent suggests, well, those things are not things at all until and unless God decides that he wants to make them. So Henry of Ghent actually suggests that the order of God's knowing and God's choosing is actually the opposite, the inverse of what Aquinas suggests. That what it is that God needs to first decide, I think I want to make a world. And in that world, I want to make, we'll call them human beings. And then only after that choice, only once God has made that choice, is the human being a meaningful possibility or being for God to know. It can only be an object of God's knowledge after he's made that choice. And that really begins the sort of, that starts off this question of, well, what is the order of God's knowing? Does he just know things and then he chooses things? Or is it that because when it comes to contingent things, they are contingent on God, God actually first has to make choices about them, and only then are they things to be known? Henry of Ghent takes that second position. Now, somebody like John Duns Scotus, who is very subtle, John Duns Scotus saw something true on both sides. He thought, well, on the one hand, Aquinas is right that God, by nature, knows all things that are knowable. So he thinks that that's correct. And he's worried that Henry of Ghent's position ends up compromising that. Why? Why is he concerned about that? Well, he's concerned about that specifically because Henry of Ghent seems to have an inferential view of divine knowledge, where it's like, well, God wills that certain things will come about, and knowing that his will can't be impeded, he essentially infers that these things will come to pass. And Scotus suggests, well, I don't think God's knowledge is inferential like that. So he thinks that in terms of the nature of divine knowledge, Aquinas is actually more accurate than Ghent. But he thinks Ghent is right to say that when it comes to the grounding of possible beings, right, when it comes to contingent things, those things are only things in any meaningful way if God decides to produce them. Only if God opens himself up to say, well, I might make a world, does a world become a possible object of knowledge. And so John Duns Scotus ends up advocating something that's sort of in the middle, where he sort of splits the question, why does God know? And the question of why are these things to be known? And so in answer to the one question, why does God know? He actually sides with Aquinas. God knows all things that are knowable because it's his nature to know all things, right? So Scotus says that. But in terms of why a contingent being, you or me or some sort of futurity, why that thing is a thing at all, he sides with Ghent. It's only a thing to be known because God decided to bring it about. And so John Duns Scotus ends up taking this sort of middle road where he suggests that, yes, it's actually true. Like Henry of Ghent is correct. Contingent things are not objects, possible objects of knowledge until or unless God decides to actually bring them or give them some sort of grounding in reality. Otherwise, they are groundless. But once they are grounded, well, God knows them. And why? Because like Aquinas, it's his nature to know all knowable things. Okay, and then as this discussion goes on in time, this is where eventually what we arrive at is we get to other forms of divine knowledge like Molinism. And this is named for Luis de Molina and the Jesuit Molinists. This is a sort of later Spanish Jesuit discussion that starts to emerge, where what they start to suggest is actually the middle here refers to a middle between two scholastic terms. Amongst the scholastics, you find reference to what is called God's necessary knowledge. And this is amongst the Christian realists in the scholastic period. They thought, certain things like logical truths are just absolutely necessary. They're just grounded in the divine nature itself, God being rational. And we've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast. God being rational, that is the grounding for things like logical truths. And so those sort of raw rules of logic or mathematics or whatever it is, they saw that as necessary. Those are necessary truths and part of, therefore, of God's necessary knowledge. But then they differentiated that from God's free knowledge. So things that God introduces freely, like the decision to make a man named Adam in a place we might call Eden, with a wife we call Eve, right? Something like that. That would be something that derives from God's choice. And in this sense, this is God's free knowledge, something that he knows freely. And middle knowledge was really about something that sits in the middle. And this is where we get the sort of things that I talked about that people who are advocates of middle knowledge advocate. The Molinists wanted to suggest, people like Luis de Molina as well as Suarez, wanted to suggest that God also has this sort of middle knowledge that is not of necessities, like math. It's not of futurities, like whether you'll eat breakfast tomorrow, but it's a series of counterfactuals, hypotheticals, possibilities, what would be if, and that's what they called middle knowledge. And I'll just say, in general, there were a lot of people who were critical of this view because they weren't sure that that was a coherent position, namely because the distinction between necessary and free seemed to land you in a dichotomy where either God knows this something necessarily, and middle knowledge seemed to float somewhere in the middle. It was pre-volitional according to the Molinists. God didn't choose to have this knowledge; he just sort of has this knowledge, which seems to make it necessary. But on the other hand, it concerns beings who he'd have to freely make. So which one is it? Did he choose it? Did he not choose it? Does he just have it? If he just has it, why does he have it? Are these in some ways necessities or the contingencies? And a lot of people thought it was pretty muddy, but it's out of that discussion that you start to get that position. Now, why do I go through this whole Latin scholastic discussion if I want to say something about the Eastern Church Fathers and their position on foreknowledge? The reason is this. There's no one in that discussion that I just named who are open theists. Okay, so everyone in that position, Thomas Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, John Duns Scotus, the Molinists, they all believe that God has foreknowledge of the future. All of them. None of them are open theists who think, that the future is just some sort of blank slate that is unfolding and God has no knowledge of where it's going or anything like that. None of them take that position. And yet, there is still a discussion about the relationship between what God chooses and what he knows. There's still a discussion here, even though they all believe that God knows the future. Amongst the voluntarists, certainly, and also amongst the Molinists after them, what you end up finding are people who want to suggest, well, there is still an order to how God's knowledge unfolds, not in time, but prior to time. So John Duns Scotus introduces what's called instances of nature. And instances of nature is basically a term that he uses in order to talk about logical sequences within God's mind. And Scotus is basically what he's acknowledging is that he does not see God as a temporal being, right? Like everybody in the Latin scholastics. He understands God to be in some ways outside of time or an eternal being who is sort of not within the temporal flux of moment to moment sort of changes that we undergo. And yet, Scotus wanted to acknowledge that there is still some sort of logical order to the things that God does or decrees or chooses. And there was precedent for this before Duns Scotus. You find the same thing in Augustine of Hippo before him, if you're talking about sort of the Latin tradition. In his treatise on the gift of perseverance, Augustine of Hippo actually, when trying to explain how predestination works, he actually starts to talk initially in very temporal terms, right? Peter ends up sinning against God and casting off grace, and God faces a choice whether or not to exact justice and let Peter reap what he sows or show him mercy. And then he makes a choice. And then, in the case of Peter, he actually chooses to show him mercy. So now Peter receives more grace. Now Peter uses that grace in certain ways and so on. And he went through he goes through like a temporal sequence of how divine choices and creaturely choices relate to one another in a logical or temporal order. And then basically what he suggests is granting divine foreknowledge, we place all of that in the divine mind. And so what Augustine basically gives you is this picture where, yes, God's making choices. Do I show mercy? Do I show justice? Okay, I'm going to show mercy. Now what happens? Now what do I do? He's giving a logical sequence to it, even though he believes that all of this is sort of there as a static whole. I don't want to use static in sort of a negative sense, but that it's not a temporal sequencing. And so John Duns Scotus wants to say something similar. He wants to say, look, we know what it's like to have sequences, right? Logical orders to things that are not temporal, and sequences that are not temporal. And so in math and in logic, things unfold in a certain sequence, one step, then the next step, then the next step. And that step, even though we might calculate it in temporal terms, those steps are there in that order in a non-temporal way before we ever calculate them. And basically what John Duns Scotus wants to suggest is that the same is true in God, that because divine decrees or choices concern one event, then the next event, then the next event, even though they might be sort of held in the divine mind all at once as part of a grand providential scheme, there's still a logical order to the series of divine decrees, one following after the next. And this actually becomes the background for the sort of later Protestant disputes that you might have heard of about the order of divine decrees. So a lot of Protestants, when talking about predestination and things like that, especially within the Reformed tradition, they have these discussions about, well, does God first decree that he's going to permit the fall of man, and then, knowing that all will be damned, he chooses who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned? Or does he first choose who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned, and then he decides to decree the fall, which then becomes part of the orchestration of that outcome? That sort of discussion happens in later Protestant disputes, this order of decrees discussion. And that order of decrees has its basis, right, its background in these sort of medieval disputes about the idea that there is a logical order to decrees. Now, the reason that's, of course, important is to say that when somebody like Henry of Ghent is saying, well, first God decides to make a being and then knows that being, or John Duns Scotus is saying, well, yes, God knows all things that are knowable, but it's only after God has decided that he's willing to make a world, and in that world put Adam, does he know Adam as an object of knowledge. That, this, then that, right? This order of things only after is not really a temporal order. It's not suggesting that God decides to create Adam and then, like, now that he knows Adam, now he finds out what he does or something like that. They're trying to actually suggest that, in God's mind, in eternity, there goes from Adam is not an object of knowledge. God decides to make Adam. Now Adam is an object of knowledge. So that's what's going on. And for that reason, that's one of the reasons why people like Henry of Ghent and John Duns Scotus, they all believe in divine foreknowledge. They believe that in eternity, God has foreknowledge of the future. But they think that the order of how God comes to know that, right, and they probably wouldn't like that language, but the basis on which God knows that is that he has made a choice to make a world that has a future. And so unlike a sort of simple view where you just say, well, God knows all things that are knowable, and therefore, he knows the world and its futurities. The voluntarists want to suggest that no, God knows the world and its futurities only because God has chosen to make a world that has futurities. And so there's still an ordering to God knowing. The knowing follows after the choice to create that object. And I say that in order to say the entire discussion about the relationship between God choosing to do something, produce a world, and then God knowing the futurities of that world, it's not limited to open theism. And there is long precedent well before the open theist discussion for people within certainly the Latin Christian tradition to say things like, well, God first has to choose to create a world, and then only choosing to create a world are there futurities about that world for God to know. That's what's sitting there in that discussion. It's not an open theist view. The discussion is not about whether the future is open. The discussion is about the order between God choosing and God knowing. Now, this, I think, is obviously not the discussion that's being had in the Eastern Church Fathers. The Eastern Church Fathers are not having discussions about Molinism and about the intellect-will relationship and those sorts of things. Those are very clearly idiosyncratic to the Latin scholastic discussion, and there's something that unfolds rather naturally from, basically the disputes being had amongst the scholastics. So you don't find those sorts of discussions in the Christian East. But I think what you do find in certain figures like John of Damascus and others like Basil of Caesarea, which I'll talk about in a moment, I think you do have clear statements that they understand divine foreknowledge to follow from or follow after the divine choice. And so there still is, even though it's not as thoroughly fleshed out as what you find in the Latin scholastic medieval discussion, there still is a very clear position that emerges here. And so what is that position? So first of all, when we look at the Eastern Church Fathers, one of the things that we see that's completely ubiquitous, every Eastern Church Father says it, is that basically that there is no indication of necessity as a result of divine foreknowledge. They deny that foreknowledge indicates any sort of fate. They all reject fate as completely pagan. They also are insistent that foreknowledge does not compel the choice, but rather the choice is our own. So the source of the choice is ourselves. It is not God's foreknowledge that somehow brings about that. So they're rejecting the idea that foreknowledge somehow carries with it some sort of fated outcome. Now, what's interesting here is then when it comes to the question of, well, causality, and this is really sort of where we're getting into this sort of finely nuanced question about, well, does God sort of know that if he makes Adam, Adam will sin, and then he chooses to make Adam, and then Adam sins? Or is it that Adam only becomes an object of God's knowledge if he chooses to make him, and then futurities attach? We actually do see very clear advocacy of the latter position in several of the Eastern Fathers. So one of the places that I've obviously appealed to is John of Damascus. So John of Damascus, as I've said, in his treatment of the Orthodox faith, when he's talking about why would God make the damned, he insists that God does not know the damned will be damned before choosing to make them. How I read this in John of Damascus is that it is a very clear statement that the damned, a creature who chooses to damn himself, freely chooses to damn himself, that choice results from the creature. He first chooses to make that creature, and only then does that creature have futurities, including future choices that are objects of God's knowledge. That's precisely what I think John of Damascus is arguing in On the Orthodox Faith. Now, John of Damascus is not the only one who says this. Basil of Caesarea, too, I believe it's in his 233rd epistle, he ends up advocating the view that suggests that divine foreknowledge follows from the choice. In other words, in terms of identifying the sort of causal relationship, it is not that somehow the choice is just sort of there and known and then God produces it, but rather God, having produced a creature who is not fated, then has choices, and those choices being the object of divine knowledge, that is what God's knowledge follows from. So Basil says the same thing. And Origen, too, says the same thing in his De Principii. I don't know, I want to say it's in book 3 someplace, even though I don't know the exact location offhand. But you find those sorts of several statements. Now, I think also you find the claim more tacitly across all the other Eastern Fathers, to be honest. So whenever causality comes up, causality is always identified as saying that divine foreknowledge is not causal. It doesn't cause the choice. Also, that's oftentimes paired with is when causality is talked about, it's paired with something like foresight, namely that what causes the choice is the object known, that God foreseeing what the creature will do, that object of divine knowledge is the cause of the knowledge itself. And so this is the sort of thing you find in Clement's Stramata. Like I said, you find it in Origen, you find it in Basil, you find it in John of Damascus, it's in Chrysostom's homilies on Romans. It's rather across the board when it comes to the Eastern Church Fathers. And what you don't find in the Eastern Church Fathers is some sort of talk of God's sort of hypothetical knowledge where he knows things before he decrees them and then decrees them. You don't find that sort of order, and you don't find a series of speculations about these sort of hypothetical futurities. Now, as David Bradshaw has pointed out when we've had this discussion, I think he mentions me and mentions this point that I've made in his appearance on Faith Unaltered. David has pointed out that certain people like Gregory of Nyssa do show some sort of limited form of Molinism, I think is what he's called it, right? Some little limited form of middle knowledge. And I'll grant that with certain church fathers, you do occasionally find things like them talking about, God knowing that if he were to do this thing, then this other thing would follow, right? Like that perhaps he doesn't show this people mercy because he knows that their repentance would only be a temporal repentance or something like that. Now, I think in terms of those statements, I would point out a couple of things. First of all, those sort of instances, and there are a few instances that you can find like that in the Eastern Church Fathers. First of all, those are instances of God having knowledge of things that are, right? What you don't find is a series of hypothetical futurities about non-existent beings. So wherever hypothetical knowledge is applied, it's always applied to beings that already exist. And it's also applied to those beings in concrete circumstances. So I still think that in terms of what you find in the Eastern Fathers, even here, when this sort of thing appears, like in somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, I think it's still grounded in reality. There is something about the being that is known that gives a basis for God having an object of knowledge, namely that contrariety that has to do with if I were to handle them in a certain way, this is how they would respond. Certainly God has that sort of foreknowledge with regard to, for example, Pharaoh. He knows that he is a prideful man, and if he shows up and he declares that he's God, that Pharaoh is going to harden, crack, and resist him, right? But that is ground existing object of God's knowledge. And so there's something there to be known, something about his disposition that is in fact knowable. So I don't think that actually demonstrates in any way anything to the contrary. You still don't find in the Eastern Fathers a series of like hypothetical futurities about hypothetical alternative possible worlds that might float about into God's knowledge. And as I said, when talking about foreknowledge, the insistence is that the thing foreknown is the future choice. It's because that choice is a future choice that God knows it as an object that's out there. You don't find this sort of like hypothetical foreknowledge that then becomes the basis of choosing things. It is always that God's choice to create a world that has certain futurities. From those futurities follows God's knowledge, follows God's foreknowledge. And so all of that is to say that, again, framing this in terms of like what this view is, it is not a view that's advocating open theism, right? I do not think the Eastern Fathers are open theists. They clearly believe that God has foreknowledge of the future. They don't think it's sort of an open blank slate. But it's the question of whether or not divine foreknowledge is something that God just has, and then he makes choices about the things he foreknows, or whether or not it's that God makes choices about producing certain beings, and then, having made the choice to produce those beings, futurities and knowledge about their choices begin to append to those beings. And I think it's quite clear in people like Basil and people like John of Damascus and people like Origen that that is the explicit position. That latter position is that God makes choices, and from those choices, knowledge of those beings and their futurities begin to append. And I also think that's the tacit claim that's there within these other claims about causality. I also, incidentally, think it's there in a very interesting doctrine that we only have. I think I've only got like a little north of 10 minutes, so I can't go into great depth on this. But those of you who follow my Substack know that I've been doing a series on predestination, and I've gone through the first 3 installments on that, which are really about the Latin West discussion, and the 4th installment that is still owed, and it's coming, I promise, is on the Eastern patristic view. And one of the things that I'll talk about in that final section that's owed is this rather fascinating point amongst the Eastern Church Fathers, which is that they don't believe that predestination is causal. In other words, when the Eastern Church Fathers talk about God predestining people to certain ends, they understand this to be true actually of all beings, that you and I are all predestined to become saints. God has a certain idea of what you are supposed to become. And this is tied in with the doctrine of the logoi, which you might have heard of, these being the words of God. But the Eastern Church Fathers took a position in terms of a position that I've touched on in other episodes, that unlike the Platonists who think that, well, God just decides to make generics, right? He has archetypal ideas of squares and circles and cats and dogs and humans and horses and whatever. The Eastern Church Fathers understand that God chooses to make subjects, individuals, you and me. And so, yes, he's got an archetypal idea of what a properly formed human being is in the generic, sure, but he's also chosen to make, Dr. Jacobs, and he's chosen to make you, Sarah, and you, Adam. He's chosen to make you individually. And so he has an archetypal idea of you, and that archetypal idea, again, being tied in with the fact that God is provident and good, means that idea, right, that logoi that he has for you and me is actually good. It's that you actually attain to your proper end of becoming a saint. And that is actually, when they talk about predestination, the Eastern Church Fathers, they will oftentimes talk about predestination as that God has predestined us, you and me and everybody else, to be conformed to the image of Christ. But he's also left it in our hands whether or not to conform to that or not. This is the sort of thing where Maximus the Confessor talks about a tropos, or a mode of being, where the choice or the direction we take ourselves can either be in accord with that, and that is proper formation, or it can be corruptive because we're diverging from the thing that God has made us to be. Anyway, once I release the piece on predestination, you'll see this. But I think it's rather decrees. What you have in the Eastern Church Fathers is a decree or a predestination of every being to become a certain thing. And yet, then there is free choice given to the creature, and God, foreknowing what those choices are, also foreknows or foresees whether or not that creature conforms to the end that he has ordained for them or not. And this is actually precisely why the Eastern Fathers understand the Christian view to be so contrary to the pagan view, because predestination is actually not fate. It's not causally efficacious. It is something that God has laid out for you. It's something that God calls you to. It's something that God beckons you to. It's something that God works to bring about. But at the end of the day, he has still made you a self-determining being who has the ability to conform to it freely or to reject it. And so this is where you have an interesting sort of parallel where on the one hand, there are the things that God has decreed. On the other hand, there are the things that God foreknows and deals with in his providence because he's engaged in a synergistic or dynamic interplay with free beings. I think I only have a few minutes left if I'm actually going to win this bet and go ahead and, make this in under an hour. I'm just going to quick talk about a couple of things, why I think this is significant. Because you might listen to this and go like, okay, this is all finely nuanced metaphysics. And why does this matter, Dr. Jacobs? I don't really get it. And so I'm just going to just touch on some points where I think it really does matter. And then I'll point you to some other things where I've talked about these same points at greater length if you're interested. I mean, maybe you're not. The whole point of this type of episode is to see if I can just give you sort of the boiled down summary if you're not interested in a 3-hour, 4-hour, 9-hour, 12-hour series. So first of all, I'll speak as a metaphysician who cares deeply about whether or not things are true or false. And I think this matters just because it's true. I actually do take the position that suggests that in order for something to be an object of knowledge, it actually has to be grounded in reality. For that reason, I think to talk about God somehow having knowledge of contingent beings without any sort of willingness to produce them is nonsense. I think the talk of knowing choices of beings who do not exist and will not exist is also nonsense. So actually, on just a metaphysical side, I think the Eastern Church Fathers have the correct position on this. And for that reason, I would actually say it matters, well, just because it's true. The other thing that I would point out here is that, and you can certainly get this from my series on the problem of evil. You can get this from the audio letter on why would God make the damned. I've talked about the fact that when the theist, and especially the Christian theist, begins to engage in questions of, anti-proofs, like why would God do this, the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness, there's a certain moral objection to it. There's a moral grounding to that that's saying that God ought to have done otherwise. And when the theist or the apologist comes along and begins to respond to that, one of the reasons they go to things like qualified omnipotence, for example, is because they want to say, well, the objector is proposing something that's not actually meaningful. They're saying that God ought to do this thing, but the thing that they're saying isn't really possible or coherent or something like that. And I've talked about that. I talked about that in the Problem of Evil series, especially I've talked about that also in the Problem of Divine Hiddenness series. And so I think it's relevant because when you're getting into issues like, well, why would God make the damned? Or if God knows that somebody will be damned before choosing to make them, then he ought not to make them. I actually think there's some legitimacy to that. And so whereas I would say that John of Damascus's answer actually is a very good answer to it, which is one of the reasons I advocate for it in my letter when I respond to that question to that one inquirer. And so I think it matters on sort of an apologetics level in the sense that it really does address certain types of objections like that begin to emerge. The other thing I would also point out here is I think this view actually makes our choices really our own. And I'm not sure that's true in certain other classical positions. So if we were, for example, to take a Molinist position, a middle knowledge position that says, well, God knows that if I'm placed in this circumstances, I'll do this. But if the circumstance is tweaked, I'll do that, and so on. And then God begins to orchestrate. I don't think my choices are really my own. I think at that point, even though we're sort of fudging and we're trying to say, well, I would freely do this, we really have God being the one who is making my choices for me. He's looking at the various outcomes and he's deciding what circumstances to create in order to produce the choice that he desires. And he is, in a certain sense, taking that choice out of my hand. Whereas the Eastern patristic view, I think, is one that actually is fully committed to the idea that God chooses to make creatures and he really allows them to be self-determining. Now, yes, of course, God is providentially working to bring about the ends that he has designed for us. We're not deists, right? This view is not a deistic view where God just sort of makes the clockwork and lets it run. But nonetheless, there is a real commitment or acceptance of the fact that we are self-determining creatures such that the workings of providence and of history are ultimately synergistic. There is genuine interaction where God allows us to self-determine in ways that he would not desire. And I think that's relevant to basically every anti-proof. So when we're talking about things like the problem of evil, or we're talking about the problem of divine hiddenness, or we're talking about why would God make the damned, that is extremely relevant. In fact, I think it's perhaps one of the most relevant things that differentiates the Christian view from the pagan view, whether that's a deistic pagan view or a fated pagan view. I think this is a relatively unique and central feature of Christianity that differentiates it from other views of the pagans. One of the other ones, which is probably a bit peculiar to folks, but there are a number of places in the Bible where certain aspects of how God deals with humanity is a little perplexing to the classical theist and a little less perplexing to, say, the open theist. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, right? One of those is where God, after testing Abraham and asking him to, slay his son Isaac, offer him as a sacrifice, God stops Abraham, of course, from doing that, but he tells him, "Now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your son." And obviously the classical theist has some difficulty trying to grasp, he has foreknowledge. What do you mean now I know? That language seems to violate that sort of thing. Or even in the book of Isaiah, there's a point where God talks about, "I had hoped you would do all these things and then come back to me, and you didn't." And those are the sorts of phrases that just don't seem to make sense under sort of the typical sort of Western Latin simple foreknowledge view, where God just knows all of these futurities and then decides what he's going to do after the fact, where the order is sort of reversed in that way, where the knowing comes first and then the choosing. But I think the Eastern patristic view, as I've described it here, actually has an easier time dealing with that sort of thing. Not because God discovers on Tuesday at 3:00, something like that, but because there really is a sense in which God's knowledge of certain things is a result of those things. So there's a real sense in which, if we were to think about this kind of the way John Duns Scotus does, where, God has to first decide to make Abraham, and he has to decide to test Abraham. And then in that deciding, he knows things about Abraham, including the choice that will result from his test. There still is a procedural order to this in the divine mind in eternity. And so there's a real sense in which the reason God knows that Abraham loves him is because he passes that test. Now, God foreknows that, but that doesn't make the test dispensable. The reason God knows that is because he's chosen to test him and because Abraham has passed that test. That's the basis of the things that he knows, just as the Eastern Church Fathers say, that the foreknowledge of those things follow from those events, that the foreknowledge of those things, the reason he knows those choices is because they're future choices. And in this sense, you can even talk procedurally about something like God deciding to allow Israel to go astray, hoping that they will return to him, and because their choice is not to, being disappointed that they do not. It's not that it unfolds in time the way it does for us, but the fact that there is some sort of procedure here within the divine mind in eternity makes that sort of language meaningful. So I would also add that to the list, that I think this way of understanding divine foreknowledge is one of the only ways that I see to make sense of the biblical language without resorting to open theism, where God just doesn't know and then discovers it on Tuesday at 2:00 or something like that. I think the Eastern patristic view actually can account for the biblical language. And finally, I'd just say this. and I think I'll probably be out of time with this one. What we have to say about God, how we envision God in these sorts of things matter in terms of how we see God. So if, for example, when we look at the Old Testament, and we see in the Old Testament a God who is simply, hot-headed and bloodthirsty and genocidal and so on, that begins to create a certain picture of God. Now, if in contrast, we begin to look at that narrative and somehow we begin to see what the Eastern Church Fathers see, a very different sort of picture of God who is building toward a longer story that has as its end the redemption of all things, the sort of thing that was laid out and discussed in our series on the problem of evil, then we get a very different picture of God. And I think the fact of the matter is that the pictures of God that emerge can be either true or false. They can be either accurate or they can be distorted. And so the type of picture that emerges in these sorts of metaphysical discussions really do matter. And I think when it comes to the Eastern Church Fathers, I think they're offering what is a proper and accurate picture of the God of the Bible and of Christianity. And with that, I'm going to call time. Did I make it? I think I made it. Look at that. I did it. All right. Well, there we go. That's our first installment of, this sort of new segment within the podcast. A couple of things for you, the listener. First of all, question is, do you like this, right? Do you want me to periodically do these more truncated episodes where we're trying to reel me in and land at an hour rather than just sort of letting me run for hours and hours and hours without end? Is this useful? Is this helpful? Is this something you like to have the occasional concise, if we can really call an hour concise, a concise treatment of a topic? If so, then, let us know in the comments. Also in the comments, if there's any sort of specific topic you'd like me to try to tackle in brief, let us know that as well. So my concept, one of the things that my producer and I have talked about, is maybe trying to offer the sort of Cliff Notes version of certain episodes that have been really long, right? Do the Jacobson Brief version of Divine Hiddenness, the Jacobson Brief version of, the problem of evil, the Jacobson Brief version of, not just the most important question, realism, and also the case of realism, like wrap it all up in 1 hour. And so those are some of the things that we're thinking. But if there's certain episodes, certain topics you'd like us to consider in this format, let us know that down in the comments as well. And also a branding question. I mean, I am not committed. You can tell from my tone, I am not committed to this Jacobson Brief sort of a title. It might be pretty lame. Any marketing geniuses out there with brilliant ideas, what you think we should call this segment when we're trying to talk about the sort of concise, talk about a topic in a concise fashion? If so, put that down in the comments. So there you go. And as always, like and subscribe and comments and tell your friends. And as always, thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me. And with that, I'm signing off. I'm Nathan Jacobson. This is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.